Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Denison webinar today titled Mergers and Acquisitions, How Culture Can Make or Break Your M&A Strategy. This is the first part of a two-part series. So in today's session, we're going to be talking more generally about culture integration with respect to M&As. And in the second part, we're going to hear from one of our clients who's led a highly successful integration effort. My name is Alice Westag. I'm a project manager here at Denison and your facilitator today. Leading today's presentation is the president of Denison Consulting, Brian Adkins. Brian has been involved in many of our M&A projects at Denison, so he's going to share some of his insights and experience that he's gained over the years. And just a few things before we get started with the presentation. We have an hour together today. The presentation itself will be about 40 minutes long, and then we're going to have a few minutes to answer some of your questions. So we encourage you to think of those questions as the presentation is going, send those over to us so we can start to organize those for the end. And remember to submit a question. You'll use the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And as a quick disclaimer, we don't always have enough time to answer everyone's question, so if we don't get to your specific question, I do apologize in advance. With that, Brian, do you have anything to add before we get started?
No, I think that covers it. Appreciate the insights and the setup there, Alice. And, you know, I guess as I'd start, I'd like to also thank everybody for joining us today. I'm assuming this must be a topic of great interest. We've had close to 200 people register for this particular webinar, and at last glance I was noticing that we have at least 4, maybe even 5 different continents represented on the call today. So as always, we appreciate the interest and the participation. So as we get started today, I guess one of the things that came to mind for me, and I'm sure comes to mind for a lot of people, is, you know, should we even be talking about mergers and acquisitions at this point in time? Depending on the variety of statistics that I've looked at, certainly over the last few months, people talk about how the level of M&A activity is down anywhere from 35 to 50% over the past 18 months. However, and I just gathered some comments and quotes and ideas that people have been putting out there relative to this topic. And what you notice is that there are a number of people who are suggesting that in a down economy, it's actually a really good time to be thinking about making acquisitions. Now, I think, you know, we have to qualify that by saying that, you know, as is the case with any kind of buy low strategy, you absolutely need to have the resources in these times when resources are relatively tight to even be engaging in this kind of activity. But there are those who suggest that this is a good time to be thinking about it, and that in some respects the return on investment can be quite better than in, let's say, less riskier economic times. Many of the same people who are saying that this is a good time to be thinking about acquisitions are also saying that this is a time when, if you are doing these deals, you have to be even more thoughtful about the work that you're doing. That it says synergy capture is even more critical in a downturn, that more discipline is needed throughout a deal, from the planning through the execution and finally integration. I thought there was another interesting comment that I came across that said acquiring companies are at risk of getting a damaged culture, a culture that has weakened values, or a workforce that has potentially been beaten down over time. So you end up with a, you know, less than motivated staff, perhaps an organization where some of the top talent has already jumped ship. So on the one hand, they're saying this can be a really great time. On the other hand, they're saying doing deals has to be done with even more thought, and that there are some inherent risks with conducting mergers and acquisitions during an economic downturn. You know, a second thing as we're getting started here today is I'd like to use our model just to remind everybody that when we talk about culture, we're talking about culture as a business issue. It's not just about developing a healthy workforce, but rather a healthy workforce that delivers performance, performance such as profitable, efficient operations, quality products and services, that's innovative, satisfying customers, and yes, I know we're all ultimately hoping that at some point that also implies growth for organizations as well. And I think one of the reasons, and perhaps a primary reason why cultural due diligence has taken a back seat, if it even has a seat in some cases in M&A activity, is that it's often viewed as the soft stuff and the stuff that's ambiguous and difficult to perhaps even more difficult to manage. And so we always want to reinforce to leaders and employees that the culture is a business issue, and it is something that is both measurable and manageable. Another, just continuing to use our model here for a moment, I want to share with folks one of the other things that we've certainly noticed, and that is that the focus of most M&A deals tends to be, or at least is espoused to be, externally focused. And what I mean by that is when you ask leaders to share the rationale for a merger acquisition, you'll typically hear things, such as, well, it was for us to move into new markets or to acquire some new technologies, increase our scale, provide access to lower cost operations. And one of the things that we've certainly noticed is that after a deal is done, once the ink starts to dry a little bit, much of the energy, much of the focus for the people in the organization gets drawn internally as they start trying to integrate the organizations. So they're focusing on the alignment of IT systems, financial systems, getting their compensation systems aligned, trying to figure out a common sales process, et cetera. A lot of internal integration work starts to take place. And so one thing that we often advise clients and talk to clients about is that in the weeks and months immediately following a merger or an acquisition, it can be a pretty vulnerable time for an organization, because as they're focused on their internal integration efforts, they have customers who may feel neglected or taken for granted. There are competitors who are out there trying to step up their efforts to take business away. So we like to remind people that, it's about balance. And that's not to take anything away from the internal integration effort, because internal integration is indeed important. And in fact, many of the synergies and cost savings that are generated through M&As occur through those internal integration efforts. But certainly one of the key insights that actually went into, I think, the development of the Denison model, and has certainly been reinforced by years of research, is that the high-performing organizations are able to manage the dynamic tensions that exist in organizations. And by that I mean they're able to manage that sort of internal versus external tension that we often experience on a day-to-day basis. And they're able to manage that need for being both stable and flexible in the way that they go about conducting business. So again, it's about balance.
So, Brian, would you say that it's safe to say that our Denison model offers a way for organizations to look at both the internal and external aspects of their business as they're going about their cultural integration efforts?
Yeah, that is a safe thing to say. In fact, I find myself reminding clients and people who use our work all the time that before there was a survey, there was the model. The model came out of the research that Dan Denison has done to determine the key aspects and traits of high-performance organizations. That ultimately led to creating some assessments to explore those particular traits. But the culture model itself serves as a constant reminder of those core traits that we need to pay attention to: mission, consistency, involvement, adaptability. and reminds us that we need to pay attention to those traits during mergers and acquisitions, as well as basically throughout the life cycle of any business. So I'd just like to remind people about the usefulness of the model as a framework to think about their business, think about what they're doing. Now for today, we obviously are focusing about culture in M&As. And just a quick note, as Alice mentioned earlier, we will continue this discussion next month with some very specific insights from one of our client organizations about some of the lessons learned and things that they did well, and some of the things that they perhaps could have done better during their particular culture integration effort. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end of today's session.
So Brian, as we move into the specific part of the presentation on mergers and acquisitions, I know that Denison gets invited into M&A projects at all different stages in the integration process. Sometimes we're invited in when the merger acquisition is well underway and maybe things aren't going as well as expected. And there are other times when we're invited very early in the process. Can you share some insights about these various stages and the activities that are helpful for getting organizations on track?
Yes, indeed. As you mentioned earlier, Alice, I've had the opportunity to work on a variety of M&A initiatives, and one thing that is encouraging to me is that as some people are calling for, as we noted earlier, greater discipline in the M&A process, we are increasingly being sought out very early in M&A discussions, and that, as I said, is something that's been quite encouraging for us as an organization. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that many organizations are being more thoughtful, a bit more proactive, as they try to execute against their M&A strategies. And, as we reflected on our M&A work through the years, we created this model that reflects some of the key places in time where we at Denison, with our emphasis on culture, have gotten involved in merger activity. From the initial growth strategy discussions through the evaluation of potential targets for mergers and acquisitions, and through the eventual selection and integration of these merged organizations. And so today what I wanted to do is just share this model with people and share just a few insights about each of these places in time and some of the activities that we get involved with. And I want to start with the growth strategy piece. In the past year, we have had more conversations with organizations that are developing their growth strategy, preparing themselves for an acquisition as a key part of those strategies. And an important question to ask at this time is, what are our cultural strengths and challenges, and are we prepared to successfully integrate with another organization? So you can see some of the very basic questions that we're trying to help organizations talk through and work through. Things like, do we have a clear mission, which would include a clear sense of both long and short-term direction and priorities? How adaptive are we as an organization? Are we good at understanding and anticipating the needs of our customers? Do we have high employee involvement? Are our people empowered? Do they collaborate? Do they have skills that are valued and developed in our organization? And then ultimately, do our systems, current systems and values create aligned action, consistent behavior? It's really about, in this very, very early stage, about getting your own house in order.
So, Brian, the focus here is on understanding your culture before you start to try and integrate another culture into your organization. But is this a strategy that we see very often?
Well, I guess often is a relative term. The point I guess I would make here is that We're certainly seeing it happen a lot more today than at any time in the past decade. We're seeing it happen more often today where clients are reaching out to us. And I'm sure a lot of it has to do with the current economic situation where people are taking a little bit more of a wait-and-see approach. They are being a little bit more thoughtful about where they're going to invest their resources. And so as they're contemplating and creating their strategies, the good news is they are already thinking about culture and engaging us in some of those conversations. So as we continue around this model here from the growth strategy to what we're talking about here is, looking at potential targets. And as part of the strategy discussion, it's important to consider the basic level of integration that will be required to make a merger or an acquisition successful. So some of the scenarios here might include whether or not this is going to be a holding company, one where you're going to purchase a business, allow it to continue to basically operate as a standalone business with very minimal, I'll say, interference and integration needed to keep that organization moving. Those situations occur occasionally. There's the absorption, where a company is acquired and becomes part of a larger organization. And so if you're the company being acquired, that can often mean some fairly significant change for the way that you do business. And then there's the more transformative type mergers and acquisitions, which result in some fairly significant change for both organizations and how they conduct business. And one of the things, and there can be variations of these various scenarios, but again, being thoughtful and clear about what for this particular deal that we're thinking about, what are the integration implications is important. And people will say, well, how do we begin to even assess some of these potential targets with respect to the culture that we might be inheriting? And there's a number of things you can do. Sometimes, conducting a culture survey makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people don't feel like, for confidentiality reasons, or just they just don't want it to be raise any concerns in an organization, that reaching out and conducting a culture survey may not be the best approach. So there's other ways that we can also start to learn something about the culture of an organization. We can conduct interviews with leaders and customers and key employees in organizations, and we often do that using the Denison model. So we're asking questions about mission, we're asking questions about what teamwork looks like in that organization, tell us how you interact with your customers, how are decisions made, etc. And then, of course, there's other data that you can always get your hands on as well. You can look through press releases. You can look at annual reports from organizations where they're available. These days, you can go and find blogs from employees and former employees that will tell you something about what an organization is like. So there's lots of ways for us to at least start to get some initial insights about the potential targets that an organization might be looking at.
So a quick clarifying question on the holding company approach. Is it possible that when you're using this approach that very little integration is actually necessary?
It is possible, and it's possible that the decision will leave an organization or an operation alone. Having said that, one of the things we have noticed is that many times we see groups that were initially left alone, for lack of a better description, with very minimal integration effort put into it, that are later asked to adopt or adapt to the parent company's culture over time. So organizations that were acquired left to sort of stand on their own for some period of time. Perhaps more organizations have come under the organization's umbrella, and at some point in time down the road, they'll often say it's time to sort of bring these organizations together in a more cohesive way. But certainly initially, a company may decide that minimal integration effort is really needed. So here we're talking about understanding just the broader cultural implications as we're looking at potential targets. The next space and time that we often get involved in a merger acquisition process is during what we would call due diligence. Here, a target has been identified. More in-depth analysis allows us for greater insights regarding the culture of an organization and perhaps an opportunity to gain some insights about whether that culture is a damaged one, as we noted earlier, and as some are saying may be more prevalent in a down economy. It's basically an opportunity to do a little bit deeper dive designed to establish the cultural baseline that highlights the similarities, the differences between organizations. So we're trying to get a much clearer understanding around things like vision and strategies, and not just what those are, but how those are developed in the organization. Basic management philosophies and behaviors, core values, how decisions are made, the extent to which people coordinate within the organization, both across functions, across boundaries in the organization, as well as within team collaboration that occurs. Customer focus and this notion of risk-taking, I've got all of these things sort of color-coded back to our model. One of the things that we know is really important is we're helping organizations think through and understand cultural implications. You'll recall earlier I talked about how a lot of the energy after a deal is done becomes internally focused, and that some organizations will take their eyes off the external marketplace as they're trying to bring these organizations together. So we always want to use the model, and we want to make it explicit that we've got to understand how do we currently interact with our customers, and what are we going to do day one to make sure that we're staying engaged with those customers and continuing to meet their needs, and helping them understand what the impact of this acquisition or merger is going to have on them personally. Sometimes in this process we also ask groups to create a view of themselves as well as a perception of the other organizations. So we've actually had groups that will fill out our cultural survey, and they'll fill it out on themselves. What's our culture look like? And then they'll fill it out a second time based on what they think the other organization's strengths and weaknesses might be. And the other organization gets to do the same thing, and we bring that data together in settings so that there can be some very proactive discussions about perceptions of each other very early in this cultural process. The other thing we're trying to do during this due diligence phase is create some agreement regarding the desired culture, or what is a high-performance culture. We hear people say this all the time. Well, we want to create a single or a common high-performance culture as we go forward. When you ask them what does that mean and what does that look like, and particularly how are you going to explain that to your employees, they're often not sure exactly how to articulate that. And so one of the things that we've learned is by bringing a model in that provides a common framework, common language to people, allows them to show people this is the kind of profile of a high-performance organization that we're striving for. This is the language that we're going to use to talk about it. And during the due diligence phase, this is before the deal is actually done, you can already start to be planning to address some of the gaps that we might be discovering as we're looking at these similarities and differences. One note here that I always like to remind people about is a lot of these conversations are very strategic. The vision, the strategies, management philosophies, core values, etc. These can be some relatively high-level discussions. And one of the things that we've noticed is that employees, their concerns, at least very early on in an M&A process, can be at two very different extremes. On the one level, they do want to know what the vision and strategy is. They want to know why this deal makes sense and sort of the ultimate purpose for going forward. At the other end of the extreme, they are very concerned about very personal issues, the what about me issues. And so again, we always want to remind organizations that as you're figuring out how you're going to address all of these potential gaps as you bring an organization together, you've got to relatively quickly pay attention to what about me, what's going to happen with my role, my level in the organization, Will I have a role in the organization? What's going to happen to my salary, my 401k plan, vacation policies, etc.? People will be concerned about all of those what about me issues. The other thing that we're doing here in the due diligence phase is we're trying to provide as much transition team support as we can. Lots of transition teams are usually identified during this phase to start talking about how are we going to bring systems together and how are we going to start to align these organizations. And so we again use our model often to provide some education and to remind them that in addition to the internal integration piece that you need to be thinking about, don't lose sight of the external focus. So here we're talking about in-depth analysis as well as beginning to plan for the ultimate integration of these organizations. Here, now the deal's been done, and although we're seeing much more attention today paid to culture in the very early stages of merger and acquisition planning, the point in time that we most often get contacted is when a deal is completed and the cultural integration efforts have begun in earnest. And an important first step, particularly if there's a newly formed executive or leadership team, is to focus on that senior team alignment and engagement. So some of the activities that might be included in that are leadership team group dynamics, so just basically developing the team relationships, creating a team charter, which is essentially agreement about how are they going to work together as a team. Helping them develop some of their strategic communications. What are the key common messages that every leader should be putting out into the organization on a regular basis? Helping leaders think about how they can be visible and accessible. Mergers, acquisitions that create times of a lot of uncertainty. People need to see the leaders. They need to be able to have some access to leaders and again, get some consistent messages from them. And the leaders need to be able to articulate a vision, a roadmap for the future. What are going to be the unifying strategies? What are going to be the unifying values that are going to help bring us together to help us move forward together? And then any other prioritized actions, because there are so many things that leaders can pay attention to in the very early stages of a merger or an acquisition. And the idea here is to agree on a few areas of priority to help foster some alignment and some focus for the members of that team. Now, continuing phase here for a little bit, beyond the leadership team, it's also important in the early stages of cultural integration to include the integration teams. Again, a lot of times these integration teams may have been determined prior to the deal being done. Sometimes they're set up right after, and sometimes you have both going on at the same time, previously existing teams and some new integration teams. But the idea here is to, again, educate these folks, help them understand the culture model, cultural implications as they're trying to bring groups together. This is an opportunity to sort of rally the change agents, if you will, to help cascade actions and messages down into the organization. And then again, just as a sort of an explicit reminder that you need customer-focused teams. You need teams who are specifically paying attention to the customers and how we're going to manage the integration of our customer service and customer understanding efforts. And certainly beyond that, then there's the broader employee population. So it's unfortunately we just don't have a lot of time today to go into too much detail around how do you start to unite all of the employees around this creation of a common high-performance culture. Next month we'll get, I think, some pretty good, very specific examples that have been used. But the idea here is that very quickly you need to introduce the broader employee base to the organization's vision and values, engage them into some in some transition activities. So these can be discussions about what do we need to leave behind as we move forward together as an organization. What are some strengths from our legacy organizations that we wish to leverage, and how are we going to do that? Dave Brandon, CEO of Domino's, who's a client of ours, shared this quote with us, and it's one that I find is really helpful during times of mergers and acquisitions as we're asking people to give some things up or change the way they do things, and that is to simply remind them that change is not a criticism of the past. That too often I think people feel like, or focused, at least in the early stages, on what I'm losing, what I'm leaving behind, and they see that as somehow a implication, and perhaps a negative implication, for how things have been done in the past, when indeed that's rarely the case. It's more about what do we need to change and how do we need to change to move forward. And then last, one other important aspect of the integration piece is very quickly starting to develop some personal connections among employees, and looking for opportunities to do that through some variety of social events, and just bringing people together face to face so that they can get to know each other. So that's about taking action at this point. That's what we're really saying, is now that the deal's been done, we need to take action. We need to take action with the leadership team. We need to take action with integration teams, and we need to start taking action with the broader employee base. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're referring to here is this notion of creating one business. Because while much of the initial integration activity is focused on addressing the legacy differences as time passes, the organization's efforts should really start to focus more on the common culture, or the creating of one business. And we added this piece in here as sort of an explicit reminder that sometimes we see the momentum of the initial integration efforts start to subside. There's less communication, there's less feedback, there's people start to sort of pull back from some of the integration efforts, and sometimes they start to do that a little bit too soon, and we start to see some of the legacy issues start to creep back into the conversations and in the actions and behavior of people in the organization. So one of the things, again, that we just want to remind people of is that as you get 2 months, 3 months, 6 months out into this process, you still need frequent, ongoing communication. As I mentioned earlier, mergers and acquisitions create change, and most of us know now that one of the things that's very critical in any kind of significant change process is being kept informed, feeling like you're involved, feeling like the change is happening with you as opposed to happening to you. So making sure that there's still some all-hands meetings, town hall meetings, opportunities for people to interact within their functions and groups and provide feedback into the organization, react to changes that are going on in the organization is important. And this is where you can start to, or at least move further along the execution path of aligning a lot of your systems. And again, we're putting the customer focus piece up there first, just to keep that on the front burner, if you will, for people, to remind them that let's get those customer systems and processes aligned, embedded, well-oiled, so that we're moving forward and taking care of our customers, making sure that we've got our aligned sales and marketing processes, making sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're clarifying roles and responsibilities. It's about putting performance management systems and reward systems and comp and benefit systems in place that will reinforce the type of culture we're trying to create, making sure that we have a common approach to how we do talent development. Again, the work norms that are going to help people understand what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, from things like work hours and flexibility and teleworking, those kinds of things. Again, it's really about aligning systems that will support the espoused culture that we say that we're trying to create in the organization. And at some point, when the integration effort has hopefully been implemented in a successful manner, the question becomes one of continuous improvement and how do we continually maximize the effort of our people, of our employees. A key indicator of the success of an integration effort is when the discussions start to shift from our legacy differences and how do we reduce the ambiguity around roles, responsibilities, compensation systems, etc., to more of a future focus, and where you're starting to see and hear a lot more discussions about our common culture and will our common culture support the business goals and objectives that we've now laid out for the future. And so at this point, again, this is hopefully 9 months, a year, 15 months down the road, that the conversations are much more about where are we trying to go together, what are our key business goals and objectives, and now it's looking at the culture as a whole. It's no longer looking at the legacy differences, but looking at the culture as a whole and saying, do we have the culture in place that's going to help us achieve those business goals and objectives? So it's more about, at this point, the proactive, ongoing management and alignment of our human capital, our people. And here we're doing things like using culture data as what we would call the eyes and ears of the leadership teams. When you start looking at the organization as a whole and the culture as a whole, you start to get a really clear idea of just how well the integration effort has gone and where we've perhaps paid more attention and where we've paid less attention. That data will start to show up in the profiles you'll see of your organization. As part of any development and sustaining program, we always think in terms of leadership development, making sure that we're identifying and putting leaders in place who, again, will reinforce the type of culture that we're trying to create, and providing development opportunities. And some of the organizations we've worked with at this point will use like our Leadership 360 as one of the tools because it links back to the culture model. So it allows them to see leaders on a very personal level and their impact that they're having on the culture of the organization, to see what kinds of personal changes they may need to make to help support the organization's movement. So here, the focus is no longer about legacy differences. It's more about how do we just continue to create a high-performance culture that's going to help us deliver the business results that we need going forward. And here's just one more way to look at this this model right now. As I mentioned, if we step back and look at the model as a whole, what you'll notice is that initially, there on the right-hand side, a lot of the discussion, a lot of the focus is on cultural differences so that we can more proactively address and manage any potential areas of conflict, as well as recognize and leverage some of the areas of synergy that we are potentially going to get from this particular deal. And here you're seeing that as you move through those early stages of cultural integration into the creation of one business and then into the development and sustaining mode, basically as your integration efforts start to mature, then the focus becomes much less, if at all, about legacy differences and much more about this single high-performance culture that we're trying to create and develop as we go forward. And I thought I'd share with you, this is just a graphic representation. We often say that the culture data that organizations collect is designed to do a couple of things. One is to facilitate focused conversations in an organization, and the second is to generate focused action. So again, this is a graphic representation. What you're seeing here is an organization on the far left that is about to acquire another organization, first by looking at their, and then in the middle there, you're seeing their profile again on the top, and below it is the organization that they are acquiring. And so here you're seeing, in a very graphic way, the similarities and differences between two organizations. You may notice that in both cases there are some opportunities in the red section, the mission area, the strategic direction. So you have two organizations coming together who are struggling a little bit with what are their longer-term strategies and priorities. That's good to know as these organizations are coming together, particularly if one thinks the other one's going to be able to provide that. The answer is perhaps not. Perhaps this is something we need to figure out together. In addition, you'll notice that the company that's being acquired on the bottom half there has some stronger scores in things like capability development down there in the green section versus the company that's acquiring them. The intent here is to, again, be able to proactively manage some of these discussions and talk about what are the expectations within that acquired company around capability development. What have they done in the past that's created a stronger sense of employee investment? And what should they expect, what might they expect as they come into this new organization? So again, it's using the data to facilitate those discussions on the front end, determine the actions that you want to take moving forward so that ultimately what you're striving for is, that profile on the right, which is the creation of that single high-performance organization. Now, finally, as we wrap up today's discussion here, I want to share a few words with you about what we call the recovery stage. Although this is not what I would describe as the optimal scenario, there are certainly those cases, and I'm sure many of you out there are familiar with this, where organizations basically ignore the cultural integration piece throughout the M&A process. They come to us, and we end up conducting their first cultural assessment 1, 2, 3. I've seen cases where it's 5 to 7 years after a deal has been completed. And yet you go into those organizations and people are still referring to themselves by their legacy company names. They're still talking about the way we used to do things here. They're still talking about the frustrations they have with their colleagues. I've had people even say to me, our new colleagues, and when I asked how long ago the deal was done, they said, oh, it's been about 3.5 years. And they're still referring to the folks as their new colleagues. So here, the focus is still on the legacy comparisons because at this point, people, they just don't feel integrated. This is where the culture clashes are alive and well. Everyone knows it. So we're coming in more of an after-the-fact approach. Here, divisions between the cultures, it says, are usually well entrenched, and it is often the marketplace, customers, investors, et cetera, that see and feel the impact of this lack of alignment among what we would describe as distracted and frustrated employees. So the old adage, better late than never, certainly applies here. And we often treat these organizations as we would an organization that's kind of day one trying to start the integration process. So with some very basic assessments, with some creations of cross-functional and functional integration teams, knowing that there's going to be some additional baggage and there's going to be some need to vent a little bit and air some things and a little bit more time perhaps spent on sort of getting some of the dirty laundry aired, if you will. But again, needing to get the organization thinking in terms of a single high-performance culture and what that might look like as they go forward. Now, I'm sure we've got some questions that have come up. As we start to address some of your questions, I would like to remind you that this is part 1 of a part 2 series. Just very quickly, next month we are going to be joined by Angie Menino. Angie was formerly the Vice President of Culture and Change for Reynolds America, a consumer products company. She just recently left Reynolds and took a role as the Senior Vice President of HR for Inova Health Systems in Northern Virginia. And so she's going through quite an interesting transition herself right now as she goes into one of the more visible and challenging industries right now, the healthcare system. But she did some amazing work, and the folks at Reynolds America did some amazing work in terms of cultural integration a few years ago that went on for quite a period of time. And so we're really looking forward to having Angie join us next month, because she'll be able to give you some even more specific examples and details around some of these various stages that we've been looking at today. So with that, Alice, what questions do we have?
Well, thank you, Brian, for that presentation. You're right, we do have some questions that came in, and I really appreciate all of you sending those questions in during the presentation. I had a couple of questions come in about how mergers and acquisitions are often driven by business decisions. And when that's happening, why do you think that cultural due diligence takes a back seat to financial and legal issues that the organizations are dealing with?
Yeah, I think, particularly for anybody who works in, the OD, HR, sort of human aspects of businesses, I'm sure, this continues to be a source of frustration for many of us. I think that the financial and legal aspects, while certainly complex, I mean, those things can take on a great deal of complexity, but they're often very tangible, they're very straightforward, and something that people can look at and see in documents and charts and graphs, et cetera, and kind of get their arms around it. I think the human aspects of the process continue to feel more ambiguous to people, more uncertain. People, they may at some level understand that the cultural integration and that the people integration will be important, but they really don't know what to do with that. And so I think that leads some leaders and some organizations to essentially cross their fingers and hope for the best. And I think that hopefully one of the things, at least that we've been learning as we do more and more of this work, is that you can take a lot of the ambiguity out of it. You can take a lot of the uncertainty out of it. You can use real data to help drive and facilitate important conversations in a very proactive way.
So when you're dealing with investors, do you recommend focusing on how culture relates to various business performance and various business outcomes to help show what the power of culture is?
We do. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I showed that slide very early on in this presentation today, which was, let's remind people that when we talk about culture, we're talking about a business issue, because we all know that it's really easy sometimes to push the people issues, sort of to the back burner. And whenever I'm talking to people in organizations, whether it's frontline employees, mid-level managers, senior executives, potential investors, boards of directors, whoever it might be, one of the first points that I always try to drive home with them is that this is not about creating a warm, fuzzy place to work. Not that we have anything against warm, fuzzy places to work, but this is about creating a culture that performs. And when we talk about performance, we're talking about things like profitability, we're talking about innovation, we're talking about market share, et cetera.
Great. We had a couple more questions come in about compatibility between the two cultures that are merging or in acquisition.
Sure.
One part of that question was, is cultural compatibility needed in order to create this one organization that you were talking about?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to point out that when we're talking about cultures, the culture of an organization, there's the old definition that says culture is the way things get done around here. And so in any organization, the way things get done around here can encompass many, many, many things. The Denison model and our work focuses primarily on those aspects of culture that drive performance in organizations. So when we talk about trying to create cultural compatibility, we're not necessarily suggesting that you got to bring two organizations together and have them move, in total lockstep with one another. I don't know of many organizations, who haven't gone through mergers and acquisitions where you could actually say that all of the employees move in lockstep with one another. But what we are suggesting is that you should move towards, unless the company approach we were talking about earlier, where the company is going to be left alone, you should very quickly move towards common direction, common priorities, common values, common reward systems, common compensation systems, to make people feel like that they are indeed part of a single organization.
And have you ever seen organizations that have decided not to proceed with an acquisition or merger because they think their cultures are so different and they could never be merged successfully?
It does occur, and certainly perhaps, given the relatively dismal performance that we've often heard through the years about the success of mergers and acquisitions and their ability to deliver against the projected results, perhaps it should happen more often. But I'd say it's still quite rare that culture is the derailer prior to a deal being done, that culture is the reason, although we have been involved in a couple of situations where that has been the case. Now, the other thing I always like to remind people is that our intent is always to help organizations go into the process, one, with their eyes open, so that they understand where the cultural conflicts might occur as they bring organizations together, and to be prepared to manage the differences as well as the synergies. And so for us, it's much less often, certainly, that we're hearing organizations say, oh, based on everything you've told us about these cultures, we've decided not to do the deal, but rather, thank you for highlighting for us what could be some real potential issues as we bring these organizations together so that we can address those head on as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. And Brian, we're running a little low on time, so I'm just going to ask one more set of questions related to risks. There's a lot of risk in a merger and acquisition. So a few of the questions that came in, one of those is, what is the biggest risk to manage in the cultural integration?
It's a challenging question, I think, to come up with a single biggest risk. Whenever I think about risk associated with culture in mergers and acquisitions, I just immediately think about the organizations who say, we're going to do this, we're not going to invest a lot of time and energy into the cultural integration piece or the people aspect of this merger. We are going to kind of cross our fingers and hope for the best. And there's that old saying that hope is not a strategy, and I think that applies here. So to me, the greatest risk is that people become so consumed with the financial, the legal aspects of a merger and acquisition, and they fail to recognize that strategies, goals are executed by people, and that unless we do whatever we can to get our people aligned and engaged around the strategies and goals that we've laid out for our combining organizations, then we are putting ourselves at great risk of becoming part of that, depending on the percentages you hear, but somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70% of mergers and acquisitions that fail to live up to their expectations.
And at the same time, would you say that that's also the biggest mistake that you've seen organizations make, or are there other mistakes to look out for?
I think in connection with the whole cultural integration piece, I know this will sound a bit cliche, but I think a key mistake that's often made is around communication. As I mentioned earlier, we know now that how critical and important communication is during times of change and stress in organizations. And quite often, there's nothing that creates more change, more stress than a merger and acquisition. And people need to be informed. They need to know why this makes sense. They need to know what's happening to them personally. They need clear goals. themselves. They need to hear the same messages over and over again from leaders. They need some level of certainty in a time of relative uncertainty. So, the other thing is leaders are almost always ahead of the curve with respect to changes. They've had time to think about them, process the changes, plan for the changes. Employees are lagging behind. And so this whole notion about communication and communication times 10, I think is really important, and a mistake that a lot of organizations make when they don't pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Brian, I have one more question for you before we wrap up. What is the risk, or what does an organization stand to lose of not looking at culture in the early stages of a merger acquisition?
I think I think two things come to mind when I think about not looking at culture in the early stages. One is, sort of the key thing that I think we've been trying to talk about here today, which is performance. I think they risk employees becoming distracted, lack of focus, lack of execution, and so they risk losing customers. They risk strengthening their competitors. So I think there's a lot at risk. I think the other thing that comes to mind for me is that more often than not, they will have to wrestle with and deal with these issues at some point in time. And so it's a question of, do we do it early when we have sort of a natural setting, a natural environment? We're very early on in this process. People are expecting that there's going to be problems, there's going to be issues, there's going to be challenges. Do we do it sort of in that naturally occurring setting where people are expecting and in many cases, I think, hoping that there's going to be some proactive action taken? Or do we wait for that, 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, when now, as I mentioned earlier, that sort of recovery stage where we have to sort of unearth a lot of things and dig up a lot of stuff that's just been sort of hovering below the surface, and deal with all of those pent-up frustrations that have accumulated over time before we actually get the people moving forward together.
Thank you, Brian. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us and sharing your experiences and best practices in mergers and acquisitions. We do have part 2 of this webinar coming up in September, so please look out for more information on that. And as Brian mentioned a couple of times, in that part of the webinar, we're going to be hearing from a client who has a very successful merger and integration situation and learning about her best practices. Brian, do you have anything to add before we wrap up?
Just as always, we certainly, again, appreciate everybody's participation. We appreciate everybody taking time out of their very busy schedules. We know how busy everybody is these days, and we appreciate your time.
Absolutely, and we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar.
Thanks for your help, Alice.
Thank you.